Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mr. Martino's Ledger, a podcast all about the riveting and sometimes salacious history of accounting. I'm your host, Mackenzie Thoda, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Hatchbasis, a crypto accounting firm. I'm based here in San Francisco, and today is going to be a very special bonus episode. Now, Courtney and I did not get enough talking about ancient Egypt and accounting in ancient Egypt, and so today we are doing a follow-on special episode. It's going to be a deep dive all into taxation in ancient Egypt. As I was doing the research for the last episode, there's just so much that we didn't get into. There's actually so many rich primary sources that dive into accounting in Egypt, what it was like being a scribe. And one of the books that we were looking at, Accounting in Order by Mahmoud Ezzamel, he's got so many chapters on these really niche topics, one of which is taxation back in ancient Egypt. But there's a bunch of other topics like how the accounting for mining exploration in Egypt worked, accounting for like funerary processions, or like more like the afterlife type of accounting. And so there was really a lot that we didn't get into. And so for this episode, I really wanted to dive more deeply into the taxation aspect because after all, we are a history of accounting podcast, and I just thought there was so much really interesting information here that we just didn't get to last time. So just going to be me for today, and this probably is going to be a shorter episode than what we've been doing so far. I don't think this is going to be an hour, so I'll spare you an hour of accounting history. I didn't think I'd be so into tax history, but honestly, I am. I'm not ashamed. The shoe fits. So, all right, let's go ahead and dive into it. Now, the earliest evidence of accounting ever found in ancient Egypt is in the form of tax lists on linen from what's called Dynasty Zero. So I guess that there was a time period before the Old Kingdom called Dynasty Zero, and this is around 3300 BCE. So this goes way back, and I do find it very interesting that a lot of these civilizations that we're looking at, the first forms of accounting and sometimes writing, are related to taxation. So governments and proto-governments have been trying to get their hands on citizens' money for a very long time. Now, there's different methods of taxation, not even, Dynasty Zero, that's like the first example, but methods differ from the Old Kingdom through the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom, and even after that, like getting more into the Ptolemaic period, the Roman period. We're not really going to cover that today. We're just focusing on Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom. And before really getting into the weeds of this, I just wanted to review some basic aspects of ancient Egyptian society and their economy that were relevant for this tax discussion. And some of this we actually already covered in our previous episode on accounting in general in ancient Egypt. This is just a continuation of that conversation. Now, the first point is that the ancient Egyptians didn't have money like we do today. So no coins, bills, paper money, nothing like that, but they did have what we call monies of account. So an example that we talked about on the last episode was the deben, and that was a way to standardize values through weight, because one deben was approximately 91 grams, and it was used to weight things like metals, gold and silver. But there were different monies of account for different commodities to measure, like to measure grain or to measure beer. There was different units for that. And since there was no coinage, taxes were levied and collected in these commodities that I just discussed, like grain, beer, pottery, ceramics, and compulsory human labor. So not a great aspect of Egyptian society, but it's called the corvée. We're going to get into it in a little bit, but the population paid their taxes by human labor. So you paid your tax by working for the state. There's a set amount of days that you had to basically do work for free, like public works projects, which is just insane. That was allowed. It kind of reminds me of jury duty, actually, because the same thing happens here. It's just that we have to sit in a courtroom instead of build the pyramid. So a bit of a difference there. The second point is that society was organized around the cosmic concept of maat. Last episode, I pronounced it maat, but I think it's actually maat. That's what I heard in a YouTube video that I watched as part of this research. And again, that's spelled M-A-A-T. And it means divine order, justice, righteous living, essentially an ethical code that the ancient Egyptians followed, or at least was very relevant in their society. And so the idea was that paying a just amount for your taxes upheld ma'at. So really it's a social value that was used to discourage people from cheating the tax system. But it went both ways, both on the side of the taxpayer, obviously to pay your taxes. If you do that, it'll uphold maat, but also on the side of the tax assessor to actually levy a fair tax. And the last point, which again we also discussed last time, was Egypt is organized around a redistributed economy, especially during the Middle and New Kingdom. So a way to visualize that is that taxes are flowing into the state. So people's commodities are coming into state coffers, and then money's going out for various things, like offerings to the gods, military conquests, feeding the population, feeding those workers that are being forced to work for the state. And so the taxes really enabled the pharaoh to maintain control. So just a couple of points that I thought were relevant as we begin a more detailed discussion. But as we again talked about, the Egyptians were big on tradition and keeping things the same for literally thousands of years. But one thing that did change was their taxation system, which we are going to jump into. Now, the ways I've organized this discussion is around the time period. So we're going to talk about what taxes were like in the Old Kingdom, and then they were kind of similar in the Middle and New Kingdom. So we're just going to skip right to the New Kingdom and go into a discussion about how taxes were collected then. Okay, let's go ahead and go into the Old Kingdom. And just to situate you for dates, that's circa 2600 to 2100 BCE, which is in fact before, or I guess came after Dynasty 0, which is where we found the first evidence of accounting, which were the tax list. So we are a little bit further ahead in time. Now, during the Old Kingdom period, the state employed a collective tax model, meaning communities and towns and like groups of people were responsible for paying taxes as a whole, not individual people. So the tax burden was not levied on an individual farmer and his family. It was levied on the entire town or village that he actually lived in. And so you have your local administrators as the interface between their community members and the state. Now, there's something called the Shamsu Hor, and it stands for, or it means the following of Horus. And so to enforce this model, the pharaoh would actually personally travel throughout Egypt to assess the wealth of each of his districts. And remember, those were called nomes, and not spelled like a garden gnome, but Nome. Because remember the whole conflict between Seth or Set and Osiris, his brother. He killed Osiris twice. The second time he killed him, he split him into 42 pieces and buried those pieces throughout Egypt, and each place he buried one of them was called a nome. So the pharaoh would go around, go to each of the 42 nomes and basically see how rich the province was and then levy the tax from there. But again, the main point to emphasize is that the town or the nome owed the tax versus the individual people living within that nome. Now, to do this, field surveys were conducted extensively. So the pharaoh's attendees and his army of scribes, they would measure the fields to calculate the harvest. In addition to collecting the taxes, so that he had money to run his government, it was really important that the pharaoh became visible to his subjects. The pharaoh wanted the people to see him and be like, oh, this is the person that's ruling me. So they could, I guess, put a face to the name, to put it in colloquial terms, but just a way to connect the people to the pharaoh so that they would obey him, presumably. Along with the surveys, a cattle count was also conducted. And so all the cattle, which includes oxen, sheep, pigs, goats, donkeys, anything of that kind, they were rounded up and counted, and then a percentage was taken for tax. And the same process was, I believe, done for other commodities like grain, oil, beer, ceramics, textiles, and linen. So the pharaoh comes around, his scribes are counting up everything that the province has and takes a 30% haircut off of that, and then that gets carted off to the state coffers. Now, in addition to taking things like taxing objects, there's also the corvée, which, as I discussed earlier, is the human labor tax. And this was compulsory labor service to the pharaoh. So really, who do you think built the Great Pyramids at Giza? A lot of the labor was coming from the ordinary citizens of Egypt that had to pay their dues via their labor. And so during this process of the Shamsu Hor, a census was taken. So it wasn't just the fields that were surveyed, it was the actual population that was surveyed. And that's presumably how the pharaoh was able to count up everyone and say, okay, you, and you're going to work on this project. And obviously this is done in a more administrative way, but that's how people were counted, and their tax was their time. And so, of course, the pharaoh had an army of scribes to record all this information because he wasn't doing all this himself. And since tax collection was collective, the administrators of the district would essentially get a beating if their tax payments fell short. And so it wasn't the individuals that were held responsible, it was the administrators of the particular district, like the mayor or the chieftain, the person that was that interface between the population and the pharaoh. Now, there's a wonderful relief or an image, and it shows, I think they call it Nubian clubs. Like you have these people from Nubia, which was a region, I believe, south of where ancient Egypt was. And they have these clubs, and they're beating the local chieftains or the local administrators because they didn't remit the correct amount of taxes. And then there's a bunch of onlookers, but they're scribes. Like the scribes are looking at this brutality, and it kind of looks like they're writing it down. So they're recording for all of eternity that these administrators didn't remit the proper amount that they were supposed to, and that they're getting beaten by these Nubians with these supposedly really scary Nubian clubs. And so I just can't believe that this type of artifact exists and we still see it. But yeah, as we kind of talked about last week, the Egyptians were not messing around when it comes to making sure that things were recorded properly, and in this case, making sure that taxes were actually paid. So that's all we have in the Old Kingdom. Really, there's not much evidence of what was going on the tax side besides what we talked about right now. Much more of the evidence comes from the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. So getting into the Middle Kingdom, this is where we see the biggest switch from before taxing collectively to now taxing individuals directly. And so this was a huge shift that happened, and it really could only be enabled because there was like a growth in administrative manpower, aka scribes, to actually make this happen. So if you remember the last week, we were talking about how after the Old Kingdom, there was a kind of a panic because there was a lack of scribes. This information, like how to be a scribe, was usually passed down from father to son or from wise elder folk to nobles. But once the Old Kingdom descended into disarray, that skill was lost. And so then in the Middle Kingdom, we see the rise of these scribal schools called houses of instruction, and they just started turning out a bunch of scribes, which meant the bureaucracy, the administration, that got a lot bigger. And so now you have a lot more literate people that can go out to the field to the individual farmer and tax them directly. And so this system of taxing individual people greatly matured in the New Kingdom. It started in the Middle Kingdom, that's where it got its roots, but it really matured into what we think of taxation in Egypt today. And just to situate us again, so the New Kingdom, date-wise, is roughly from 1550 to 1070 BCE. So about a 500-year period. And it's so funny. Imagine like the US lasting for 500 years and the tax code staying completely the same. That just blows my mind because obviously that's not how it works in the US. It seems with each new president, we get a whole new tax code, which definitely keeps us on our feet as accountants. But anyway, let's go back in time, back to the New Kingdom. This is where we also see the rise of the temple complex administration. So we see the rise of temple granaries, and really the temples become the state agents. And the temples are starting to play a central role in not only collecting, but also storing and redistributing the tax revenues. And so we touched on this last week, but the state becomes a lot more centralized, but the temples are really the main or one of the main economic engines. And if we break down the economy, you have the public and the private spheres. And so the private sphere is getting taxed. The public sphere is also getting taxed, but the public sphere is also heavily involved in this redistributive economy. And we're talking about the temples here. So getting back to the book that we were discussing, Accounting in Order by Professor Ezzamel, he's got a really great framework, and it's what he calls the cycle of taxation, to describe how the full taxation process works in the New Kingdom. And it's actually very detailed. I felt like I was reading one of my normal accounting textbooks, but we are going to break down our discussion of taxation in the New Kingdom according to this framework. And so there's a couple of steps here. The first step is to define who is subject to tax, so who's got to pay. Step 2 is estimating the tax liability. Step number 3 is the final assessment, so what you actually owe. Step number 4 is collecting the taxes. Step number 5 is transporting the taxes. And then the last step is storing the taxes. And these last couple of steps here are necessary because, again, taxes were assessed and remitted in commodities. And so if someone's taxing your farm, They're going to take grain, they have to ship it somewhere and store it somewhere, presumably in some kind of temple or state granary. So keep that framework in mind because we're going to be diving into each part of it. And again, just to bring it back to modern day, it just really reminds me of how the tax code in the US works today. Like even step one, define who's actually subject to tax. That's the first step that we do, right? We have to define what's your taxable status. If we take it back to the level of individuals, are you just an individual? Are you married, filing jointly, married, filing separately, head of household? And then on the business side, it's are you a C Corp, S Corp? Are you a nonprofit? So you're not even subject to tax. But are you a nonprofit, but you actually have some kind of unrelated business income? So that's the first step. Now, there definitely were some obvious groups of people that were subject to tax. So the first one was temples. So the temples were, again, huge engine or huge part of the redistributive economy, and they were definitely subject to tax. Second party that was subject to tax was state officials. And so it's really fascinating is that if you had a state office or you had an office within the administration, you had to actually pay dues for being able to have that office, or put another way, state officials paid dues imposed upon their offices. And so they didn't just have a sweet job, they had to pay for it. Now, we actually have a really great primary source here where it's a table that lists the official's office and then the tax that was owed. So, for example, the commandant of the fortress of Elephantine, the tax that they owed or that the office owed was 40 deben of gold and then 1 chest of linen. We have our next office here, which is the mayor of Edfu. This person owed 8 deben of gold, which is a tribute weight, and then a great bolt, which I assume is some kind of metal. I'm actually not sure about that. And then you have his scribe, the recorder of Edfu, owed 1 ox and gold of some unknown amount. Okay, so that was the second type of person or group that had to pay taxes. We got these state officials. Third group is the Kato lands. It was a type of land that was earmarked to supply revenues to the pharaoh. So another way to think about it is state-owned lands. And then finally, the good old ordinary people. That's how our professor calls it. So essentially everybody else. And of course, the ordinary working people, they shouldered the largest amount of tax burden. And so that included all the Egyptian citizens and also subjects and conquered territories. So if the Egyptian pharaoh conquered your territory, you have to pay taxes, unfortunately, to the person that just conquered you. So not great for a conquered subject, but great for the pharaoh because now he's got more money. So, okay, that's who actually has to pay tax. The second step in this cycle here is estimating the tax. So kind of like how in the modern tax system, we have to estimate or we have to pay estimates throughout the year. You can just pay based on what you paid last year, or you can actually calculate and forecast what you've earned for the year or by quarter and then pay taxes based off of that. The ancient Egyptians had such a similar idea and a similar system, except instead of projecting money, they were projecting crop yield. And that's the main example that we're going to take today is taxes on harvest and crop yields, because we just have the most evidence as to how that process worked, but I assume a similar process was used for all the different commodities that we've talked about as well. Now, what's really cool about the estimation step is that we actually have records from a tax assessor's journal. And so we can see firsthand what this tax assessor was thinking, how they went about their process. And just to zoom out a little bit, estimates like this were necessary for state planning, especially the grain tax, because they had to figure out, or they have to have an idea of how much that they were going to get in grain, because that affects things like how many public works can we afford to build next year, because that's going to take labor and we have to feed that labor, and that depends on how much grain we actually have stored in our warehouses. And so that's why the Egyptians went through this whole process to estimate it, and then a separate process to actually come up with a final number, because they had to do some kind of forecasting, which, people in business can definitely understand the need for that today. Okay, so before the tax was officially assessed, the land holdings were surveyed and the crops were measured. It wasn't just the scribe who's doing this. It looks like there was kind of a group that was doing this and going around to all these various farms. There was, again, the scribe, but also the clerk of the land, a person called the envoy of the steward. This individual was responsible for internal measures of the land and crop. It's a bit vague. We have the structure of the cord, which is my favorite role here. So this person actually measured the crop as it stood with an actual cord. So I just imagine like a long piece of rope, and they were actually measuring how tall the crops were. And then we have another individual, the holder of the cord, which I guess held the rope for the stretcher of the cord while the stretcher was busy doing other things. So we've got a tax assessment posse here going around to all the different lands, measuring them, and the scribe came up with estimates based on these detailed land surveys. Now, in addition to actually going out to the field, doing estimates, noting down the numbers, the scribes also use proxies for estimating what the taxable crop yield could actually be. Because that's the point of all this, right? They're measuring this land to figure out, okay, how much grain is this actually going to convert to? So they had some proxies like the size of the plot, the quality of the land, and also access to water. For example, proximity to canals, lakes, wells, trees. And then they also use those numbers to come up with some kind of reasonable guess or reasonable estimate. Now, not to get too much into the weeds, but there is a really groovy piece of technology that I wanted to talk about. It's called the nilometer. That's spelled Nilometer. And it was a specialized measuring instrument used to gauge the Nile River's water level during the annual flood season. And so there's a couple different variations this could take based on what we saw. So it could either be a long column in the ground or a stairwell that leads into the river. There's actually a really excellent example that's still standing at Elephantine Island in Egypt. And it's meant to measure the Nile River if it's low, if it's just in the right spot, or if it's too high, because that'll determine how good the yield is going to be. Or it's just another variable to help the tax assessors figure out how good the yield is going to be for the year. And this is calibrated in Egyptian cubits, so they have their own volume measuring systems here. And it's what you would think, like if there's higher flood levels, that means there's more water, so harvests are going to be more bountiful, which means higher taxes. But if there's lower flood levels, that usually means less water, maybe more so on the side of drought, or at least bad crops or bad harvests for the year. So taxes are going to be lower. And so the scribes definitely had a sliding scale here. They were trying to uphold the principle of maat that we talked about. If your land had a bad harvest for the year, because the Nile didn't flood enough, you weren't punished for that. And so this is upholding that principle of justice. Okay, so the scribe would go ahead and make their estimate based on all these variables that we talked about. And then when the crop was actually harvested, then would come the final assessment. So the scribes go back out, they'd measure the actual harvest, and then the tax liability was calculated from there. And they would also do an exercise of comparing actuals against estimates, because if someone was trying to underreport the amount of crops that they actually harvested, the scribes could be like, why is this so different than what we estimated based on all of these other variables that we took into account? So the scribes really left no stone unturned here. They were very detailed, and it just reminds me of modern FP&A, like a budget versus actual. They were just doing the same thing, but very manually and on papyrus or ostraca. Now, luckily, we have a wonderful papyrus that contains a lot of these examples of harvest tax assessments. It's called the Wilbur Papyrus. And harvest tax was based on the area of land and the quality of the harvest. And so you could get into the situation where one farmer could have a big area of land, but the different plots of land could be taxed at different rates depending on how arable the land was and what it actually produced. So overall, it does seem like a pretty fair system. If you had a lot of grain, you'd get taxed more. If you didn't, you would get taxed less. Now, the scribes had their nose in everybody's business. They helped to oversee the actual reaping of the crop so they could record exactly what was owed. They didn't just trust the word of the farmer. They were out there in the fields looking at the people threshing the grain, doing whatever the farmers needed to do, and they were recording everything that they saw so they could get the most accurate tax estimate, and no one could really cheat the system. Now, as I said, there's measurements for different commodities of tax owed. So for grain, there was a single money of account. The most famous one is the heket. There's also the kar, the oive, and this was used to quantify tax liability directly. And that goes for any other homogeneous commodity, like if there was some kind of tax on metal, then the debin would just be used. Now, that's a little bit different if there was heterogeneous commodities, so a bunch of different commodities included within the same group. There's actually a great example of game birds. And so you see this exercise where the scribe was trying to convert each game bird to a common denominator and then assessing the tax in that common denominator. So it's a lot of these little measurement conversions, which are unthinkable to the modern reader, but the ancient Egyptians definitely had a way to make everything seem apples to apples. At least that's the way that I think about it. So that's the final assessment stage, as where the scribes say, okay, this is what you actually owe. Now, the next part is the collection. And this actually seems pretty detailed and very manual because you've got a bunch of people trying to transport grain and beer and game birds from whatever part of the ancient Egypt they're in to some kind of central warehouse. So you can only imagine the amount of logistics that are required with this. And they didn't have Amazon Prime. They didn't have DHL or any of these trucking companies back then. These were just people using their brains and scribes to get this done. So we have another excellent resource for this, the Papyrus Turin, in which the scribe of the necropolis, this guy's name is Dutmos, he reported tax collection from various places south of Thebes in order to pay the rations of the necropolis workmen. So he's recording everything that's coming in, and then these rations or these taxes will be used to pay the people working for the necropolis, maybe people forced on the compulsory labor thing. So Dutmos, he's recording what was collected in a very specific way. It almost seems formulaic, but again, it kind of reads like a story. So he's recording things like the date, for example, the day, the month, and the year of the pharaoh's reign. He's recording the location, so the specific town or site of collection. He's also denoting the officials involved, so the names, the titles of all parties, including himself, and also the taxable subject, so where the actual tax came from. And then also the amounts collected, of course. So, the precise quantity in sacks because we're dealing with grain here that's being collected. Transportation details, so the names of the boats that the grain came on, the skipper identities, so the people that worked on the boat, and then also just what was within the boat cargo. Delivery information, like the final destination, receiving officials, and then a reconciliation, looking at what was received against what was actually sent to the storehouse, and probably also what was sent by the farmer in the first place. There was a whole accounting that was needed from the sourcing all the way to the storage. So here's a full example that we have, and this papyrus is actually full of examples like this because Dutmos was literally recording everything that was received. So he writes, received in year 12, fourth month of the inundation season, day 24, by the mayor of the west of the city, of the corn brought by the scribe of Necropolis, Dutmos, and the two janitors in the boat of the skipper, Dutwashabi, and the boat of the fisherman Kador. From the town of Esna, 337 sacks. Details of it. Arrived and delivered to the mayor of the corn of the fisherman Kadore, 110 and 1/4 sacks. Given as rations to the fisherman, Yet Nufe, 1 sack. Total 111, 1/4 sacks. Deficit, 2 sacks. The details of the deficit, the janitor Kensmos, 1 and 1/4 sacks. And so there's also an example of reconciliation that was included or next to this description here. And so on one side, you have what was received, so adding up all the sacks that were received. And then on the other side, adding up where those sacks actually went. They call it how the sacks were disposed of. And so you have a bunch of sacks that are coming in. Some were sent to the mayor. Some were given to the fishermen to eat. Some were given to the janitor. So I guess the person that is helping to deliver the tax. And those two things are supposed to equal. And in this case, they do. And so I think this type of accounting was done quite frequently. First, you have the story. This was received at this time by this person, and then it went over here. But you can also put it in a tabular format to make sure that it does actually equal. Okay, so that's the collection. Now we have the transportation, which I think is related to the collection aspect. As we know, ships were responsible for transporting the grain taxes, but also donkeys. I was watching this lecture, and there's a really funny sculpture or like a little figurine of these Egyptians hitting their donkeys, and the donkeys have like they're carrying some kind of burden on their back, and it looks like they're carrying grain. And so those animals were used a lot for transporting the taxes owed as well. Now, details of transportation are also meticulously recorded since skimming and corruption posed a major problem. And to deal with this problem, each person responsible in the chain was recorded. From the farmer to the officials involved in assessing the tax to the collectors, the boat skippers, probably the people driving the donkeys, everything like that. Now, we have another example passage here. It says, The cultivator Mahu, son of Amenetope, in the village of Meh, harvest tax 1,000 sacks. Disposal of it, conveyance by river to the granary of Memphis. On the ship of Amenetope, son of Nefertope, 400 sacks. On the ship of Hunuf, 314 sacks, for a total of 714. Remainder, 286 sacks. Details of the rest, taken by the quartermaster, 200 sacks. Deficit with the cultivator Mahu, 86 sacks. So again, it's a little bit difficult when you're just reading it in a story, but if you put it into a tabular format, you can see what was owed. So this cultivator Mahu, his tax was 1,000 sacks, and you can see exactly how it got conveyed to Memphis on 2 ships, and then the quartermaster took some, and it's saying, okay, Mahu still owes 86 sacks. And you can kind of tell probably already by these descriptions, but rations were permitted for the boating crews and for the people involved in transportation. Like they could eat some of the grain or eat some of the bread or drink some of the beer. That was part of the tax, but this had to all be accounted for because both sides of the received or the tax levied and then how it was delivered had to tie it out. They had to equal the same amount, which just is beautiful. Or reminds you of debits and credits, how they're supposed to equal. It's the same thing here, just we're not quite yet in a debit and credit system. Now, the last step is storage. This is pretty short here. By the New Kingdom, tax collections were stored in the state temples or other state-owned facilities. And this made it a lot less risky because the storage was more dispersed, more decentralized. And so if one temple granary was set on fire, it's not the end of the world. There is a bunch of other granaries all over Egypt and the various nomes as well. So phew, that was a lot, but that is the full tax cycle. Just to recap real quickly. Step 1 is defining, okay, who has to actually pay tax. Step 2 is estimating it, then the final assessment, collecting the tax as part of that, transporting it and storing the tax. And we have really detailed records, especially from the New Kingdom, on all of these steps in the tax process. Now, we couldn't do a discussion on taxes without talking about tax evasion, because for all periods of time, people have really been trying to not pay their taxes, even when you have like real threats like being beaten or thinking that you're going to go to hell because you didn't uphold maat. People still were trying to dodge taxes, even thousands of years ago. As I said, they had maat to govern their good behavior, but that doesn't mean everyone was as religious or as ethical as the Pharaoh probably wanted them to be. And we have examples of ancient tax evasion practices. So age-old practice here is manipulating the weighted scales to measure grain. So the farmers or whoever in the chain would sneak stones in that would change the weights, which would change the tax. And so that was like a kind of a no-brainer way to how you could cheat the system. But the scarier way to evade tax, and this is very relevant for fraud today, is collusion. And so if you had collusion between state officials, the scribes, the temple officials, you could really pull off quite a fraud scandal here. And you really needed collusion to perform these types of large-scale fraud. Again, same as today. Now, what's crazy is that we actually have a written record of a corrupt official that did the whole collusion thing, and we have the amounts that he stole as well per each year. Now, it's in the Papyrus Turin, and it involves the priest of Khnum at Elephantine. So he's a priest at a temple, which is not a great look for the temple or religion in ancient Egypt in general. But basically it was that the temple was supposed to receive 700 sacks of corn annually. But in year 28 of the reign of Ramses III, the ship captain died and a new one was appointed. And this matters because ship captains are transporting the tax here. Now, as soon as this new ship captain came into his new role, problems immediately started popping up. So you had this problem where 140 deben of gold weren't delivered to the treasury like they were supposed to, and the corn deliveries fell dramatically. So remember, the temple is supposed to get 700 sacks of corn annually, but in year 1, only 100 sacks were delivered, meaning 600 sacks just mysteriously disappeared. In year 2, 130 sacks were delivered, giving us a deficit of 570 sacks. In year 3, 0 sacks were delivered, so that just means all 700 sacks were not paid. And it goes on year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7, year 8, year 9. So I guess this wasn't really discovered for 9 years. The total liability, so the total owed at the end of 9 years, was 6,300 sacks. So if you do 700 times 9, you get 6,300. And yes, I just did pull out my calculator for that. But the total delivered was only 576 sacks, giving us a deficit of 5,724 sacks. So this ship captain or this priest, they were doing some sketchy stuff. And this is a perfect example of collusion because obviously the captain and the priest, but the scribes, the controllers, the cultivators, everyone had to be involved to pull this off for a whopping 9 years. It's like in the modern day, those tax frauds you hear of where a fraud's not discovered for like 10 years, but the person ended up stealing millions of dollars. It's like, how does that happen? Sometimes there's collusion, sometimes it's just one accountant going rogue, but in this case, there was collusion. So I just think it's terrible, but such a funny example of how this type of behavior, it's part of the human experience. It's been going on for literally thousands of years. There's always going to be bad actors, but in this case, the fraud was discovered and memorialized for thousands of years. So I hope this priest is rolling in his grave because he is a cheater, pumpkin eater, stealer. Okay, anyway, fraud wasn't that common, it seems like, because there was harsh punishment if you were found dodging the rules. So we got this edict from this pharaoh in the 13th century BCE. The guy's name is Horemheb, I believe. And he actually introduced rhinotomy, which is cutting off somebody's nose as a punishment for tax fraud. This edict writes, quote, "If there be a poor man who pays the dues, and he be robbed of his goods and his craft, my majesty commands that every officer seizes the dues and taketh the craft of any citizen. The law shall be executed against him, and that his nose shall be cut off, and he shall be sent to Tharu." So, yeah, not a great look if you get your nose cut off. Beating, obviously, was a punishment that kind of goes without saying. And we also have I don't know if this is better or worse than getting your nose cut off. Actually, definitely worse because you die. But we have this papyrus called the Papyrus Salier. And this is an example of where an individual farmer is being held responsible for not paying enough tax. We have another quote here. It goes, "The scribe has moored at the riverbank. He reckons the tax with the attendants bearing staffs and Nubian rods of palm. They say, 'Give the grain.' There is none. They beat him vigorously. He is bound and cast into the well. They beat him, drowning him head first, while his wife is bound in his presence. His children are manacled. His neighbors have abandoned them and fled. Their grain is gathered." So that guy's not having a great day either. Now, on a lighter note, we have something called the Instruction of Amenemope, and it talks about the importance of maintaining maat in this whole tax process. And essentially, it's tax collection in the way of maat, and it emphasizes fairness on both sides, both from the perspective of the tax assessor and the tax subject, so the person actually paying the tax. And we chatted about this already, but the principle was that if there was a bad harvest, the scribe would not assess a high tax. Tax amnesty was a concept, at least it seems like in theory. Now, if you didn't pay, you could die, but maybe that guy was just being greedy before, who knows? But we do have a quote that says, "If a poor man has a tax debt, forgive him 2/3. Another papyrus states, "If someone suffers greatly from the tax burden or is in an extreme situation, this should not be checked." So maybe it just depended on the scribe and how nice they were feeling the particular day that they had to collect the taxes, because we see both of these examples, right? We see like the ideal being like, oh, like you have to uphold justice. If this person can't pay their tax, then clearly you should just forgive them and wait till the harvest is better. But then you have these examples where a farmer's not paying and he's put to death. So it's really hard to tell what happened back then. Obviously, we'll never know, but it really seems like it was subjective. Now, just a couple of other things, some miscellaneous items. Same numbers were often recorded by different scribes twice to ensure accuracy. And if the numbers didn't tie up and if they were off by a material amount, someone was getting put to death, most likely. And if you were well connected and high up, you could actually dispute your tax assessment if you felt like it was unfair. Now, if you were a Joe Schmo cultivating papyrus, like you couldn't do this. Ordinary citizens did not have this luxury. But if you were official and you could pay for a scribe to redo the calculations, you could do some kind of appeals process. So that was interesting that was available back then. Like today, if you don't agree with your tax, assessment or you don't agree with the penalty, there usually is a pretty thorough appeals process or dispute process. Okay, so the very last section that we're going to talk about today is one that is peculiar to an ancient society. And this is what I absolutely love about studying ancient history. You hear these nuggets of information. I can't even call it facts. You just hear some lore, and you're like, how did people think this way? How did they live this way? But we have the physical evidence, so it must have happened. Now, the Egyptians thought that the afterlife was much like their life on Earth. And so, unfortunately for them, they thought taxes and compulsory labor probably existed upon their deaths. They were like, well, we're going to die and it's going to be the same, which means I'm probably still going to have to pay tax even when I'm dead. Which, how depressing is that? Like, the saying here is that two things are certain, death and taxes. But for them, they knew they were going to die, but they thought there was also going to be taxes after you died. So, yeah, that must have been kind of a sad existence. But anyway, tombs started including these small figurines called ushabti, and they're just little people figurines. And the idea was that these people would do the compulsory labor for the deceased in their place. And so these little figurines were inscribed with spells, and they were considered to be the servants of the person that had died. And it's so poignant that these little figurines often had farm tools. They had a hoe on their shoulder, they had a basket on their backs, implying they were ready to go to work and they're ready to farm if compulsory labor was a thing in the afterlife. So the idea was that if the deceased was called upon to perform labor taxes in the field of reeds, which I'm guessing is someplace in the netherworld, the ushabti would respond with, "Here I am," and do the job for them. Now, some tombs contained as many as one ushabti for every day of the year, plus 36 overseers to keep order. And it just blows my mind because it turns out, like, while they're alive, like in life, if you were a privileged Egyptian, you could send substitutes to do your labor tax for you, similar to how if you were higher up, you could dispute your tax assessment. So they believe that this social stratification also happened in the afterlife. And so they were like, oh, let me just include this figurine that can do my work for me. So if you were in the position to do so, you could dodge taxes, at least the compulsory taxes, for eternity. So I just think that's a super cool, poignant, kind of sad and depressing fact about ancient Egyptian society, and particularly the taxes. So that's it for our bonus episode today. Don't know how short this is going to end up being, but just to wrap it up, some overall themes for today. One is accountability. All parties involved were recorded by the scribes, from the farmer to the scribe, to the person doing the tax assessment, to the people transporting the taxes. Every chain in the line was recorded, and responsibility was plain for everybody to see. And so that relates to the next point, which is the upholding of maat, justice for all. If you didn't pay your taxes, you were punished quite heavily. But that's not to say that people still cheated the system. There's still collusion. And you see this tension between maat and the reality of it. And we see the same thing today. Ideally, everybody would pay their taxes because it enriches society and it helps more services extend to more people. But you still have people that, cheat the tax system. So, and then finally, we had a transition from collective taxing to individual taxes, which also coincided with the rise of the administrative state in the Middle Kingdom, and also just the proliferation of scribes that were all being instructed in these houses of instruction. And as you can see, this process was so extremely detailed that scribes were needed more than ever. So if anything, the accounting profession, the scribal profession, was put more on a pedestal than ever before, because this is how the pharaoh got his money. And as we know, it all comes down to money at the end of the day, at least in real practical terms. So, all right, with that, I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know if you're interested in more bonus episodes like this, where we're just doing an extreme deep dive on a very niche topic that probably like 10 people in this whole world care about, but I don't care. We care about it, and I care that you're listening. So, all right, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.